Welcome to the Fit 15 podcast show, where you'll find health and fitness inspiration, motivation, and information shared in 15-minute episodes. Tune in while getting a move on to make leading and enjoying the benefits of a healthy lifestyle almost too easy. It's the Fit 15. And now your host, Catherine Basu.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Fit 15. I am your host, Catherine Basu, and I'm really excited to have you tuning into today's episode of the show and introduce you to my guest. Before I do, though, I wanted to remind you that this is only episode 4 of the podcast. So this is a pretty new podcast, at least if you are tuning in the day it is being released. So if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to go back to episode 000 to learn more about the show, what I have planned for you, and the types of guests I would like to have on the show, because I would love to interview and share with you insights from guests that you are interested in. I really want this to be as much your show as it is mine, so definitely check that out to learn more about the show. Another important episode for you to check out is actually yesterday's episode. Like today's episode, I know it's one I'll refer back to often. In it, we talked about the difference between a registered dietitian and a nutritionist. So if you have been considering hiring one of those individuals to work on your healthy eating goals this year, I encourage you to go back and make sure you understand and are informed about the credentials of these professionals. All right, back to today's episode though. I'm really excited for today's topic and to introduce you to my guest, because she is going to help you navigate the health and fitness related information out there on a more regular basis. I shared this in episode 000, but I'll tell you again, I'm very interested personally in science because I was a biology major in school, and so that's why one of my goals is to bring on individuals who will share with us health and fitness related information and help us navigate some of the fad diets and programs and claims out there. But I know I won't be able to cover every single study that is brought up in the media. So it was really important for me to bring on today's guest to help you do that on your own a little better and give you a better understanding of how scientific research actually happens and the scientific process in general. So that's why I'm bringing on, and I'm so excited about today's guest, Dr. Amy Ryan. She is a scientist who studies primate behavior and cognition. Dr. Ryan is currently an autism research fellow at the University of California, Davis, studying how we can potentially learn more about causes of and treatments for autism by studying monkeys. She has studied monkeys in a variety of settings, from human-managed ones such as laboratories and zoos to wild populations in the forests of Uganda in Africa. Amy has a passion for engaging the public about the animals we share our planet with and for increasing opportunities for others to participate in science. Welcome to the podcast show, Amy. I am so excited and honored to have you joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I'd love to start us off, Amy, by having you share with us, from your background as a scientist, why there seems like there's often this barrage of information out there that often conflicts with other information out there, other research and studies. Why is this happening, and what can we do about it to actually navigate it effectively?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I would think the first thing about why it seems like there's a lot of information out there is because there is. And science in that way doesn't really line up well with our current values in society, and that's the scientific process is kind of slow in the sense that it doesn't take a week to do any sort of science. These are long-term studies, and you're learning the results, and you're trying to pace yourself and learn one thing and then methodically move on to another thing and keep questioning, second guessing, being critical, but continuing to improve your work through that criticism. And I think the way that society is kind of modeled right now is that we love information overload and we love fast and easy answers. And so that's something where science isn't really set up for the fast and easy answers. And especially if you think about the way science is structured for scientists, scientists are under a lot of motivation to publish studies. So you
Sure.
do the studies and then you want to publish your results because that's how you're getting it out there to the world. And that's kind of how scientists get their career launched and things like that.
Hmm.
But most studies in and of themselves aren't going to be life-changing, incredible things. The individual studies themselves are kind of a drop in a larger bucket of knowledge.
Hmm.
But what happens when people talk about studies is it's a game of telephone in that some media journalists read the original study or talked to the scientists who did the study, and they probably reported on what was in the study. And they put a little bit of a positive bias or spin on it in the sense that they want to make the study seem a little more so that it's not just a drop in the bucket, but that it really has some super valuable meaning to human health and nutrition and things like that. And
Sure.
so then another journalist or blogger, or as it works through the chain, will then read what the other journalist said and doesn't go back to the original study. Because you'll find a lot of times when you read about scientific studies, the paper itself that outlines the entire study is usually not even cited. So that's something where it's usually just people reporting on other people's reports. So by the
Right.
time you hear about a study, it's so blown up into being this crazy thing that we should all throw out this thing or do this other thing. Like it's just, okay, this is life changing. This is what you now have to do. When the original study and the scientists who did it probably in no way intend for you to think that. So that's something where I would definitely keep that in mind. And also that the study itself is the ability to publish a study is highly dependent on it working. So if you were looking at the effects of exercise and you didn't find anything, if you tried to experimentally determine whether exercise had an effect on something and you found that it didn't, that might not be interesting or motivating enough to actually go through the process of publishing it.
Hmm.
And so what you find is that for every study that is out there and they say, oh, exercise did have an effect.
Amy and I did not start a band, but that is your cue if you are joining us and walking and only have 15 minutes to turn around.
As a scientist, I would assume always that there are probably a bunch of studies out there that have been done that do not have that same result and that they failed to find that strong effect and they just never made it to publication. And so it doesn't mean that the first study's wrong, but it's just there's a lot of variation depending on what you're looking at in your study.
Got it. Yeah. So realizing that there's kind of two sides to every story, two sides to every study. Some of the studies out there that might be counter to one that we're hearing about might not be published. They might not have had enough information just yet. And then to really question where the information is coming from and what level of certainty there was in that initial study itself.
And I mean, it'll take a few clicking through links to get to the actual study. And there's also a whole part of that too, where there's an increased effort now that, I mean, most studies are available on the internet, but unfortunately, sometimes they're not available for free.
Mm.
So that's an unfortunate situation if people want to find the study and they find that they would have to pay to access the study. But I think the trend is definitely in the direction of what they call open access. So studies more and more are not going to be able to be behind what they would call a paywall.
Well, that's good to know because I think, when I've looked at some studies I wanted to learn more about or actually read myself, it's not like it's, $1 or $5. It can be
Yeah.
pretty
Oh,
expensive.
no. And the thing is with those, if you go to a library, you might be able to access it. I mean, I've
Mm.
taught students in college where they came across that situation and were like, am I supposed to pay the 30 something dollars to get this article? And I'm like, no, I don't believe, especially for studies that receive federal government funding, which is a
Mm.
lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
your tax money went to funding that study. So it shouldn't be denied that you see it. But it's the whole publication process where journals publish articles, and those journals need to be a business. So it's changing now with the internet. I think it's slow to catch up, but I mean,
Mm.
journals used to be literal pieces of paper like magazines used to get volumes and they had articles in them, but a lot of journals now are just online. And so I think it's going to change. It's a little slow, but certainly don't let that intimidate you, and try to find the article, because you might be able to click through the links, but it's can be shocking when you see how far removed the article that you're reading is based on the study.
Sure. So now let's say we go to our library, or we find the study and we're looking at it. What do we need to look for to tell if it's actually objective and well designed and valuable, or something that is not that way?
That's a good question. Well, I do have an example as I was thinking about doing this podcast, which is it came out in 2016 that said drinking red wine is equivalent to 1 hour at the gym. Which, I mean, if that's true, like, hey, doesn't everyone want to not go to the gym and just drink red wine?
Right.
But wouldn't that be awful for your cardio fitness? And I mean, I read this, and then I did the thing where I clicked through and found the actual study, and the study was done in rats. And so they're not even done in humans. And animal models for human health are a very important part of the scientific process. So if you want to understand what's going on with the human body, usually you start with a model organism, if you will. So a related organism, where if we kind of look and see what goes on in this animal, it might help us down the road with people. So it's not wrong in that sense, but certainly rats are not people. And so to immediately change human behavior in terms of stopping going to the gym to drink red wine, you can't be doing that based off of a study that was done in rodents, which is a common animal for us to look at. It gives us a encouraging clue to look at the effects of red wine, but certainly not in itself something we should alter our lifestyle for. And on that note, something else to look at. So it might sound pretty awesome if you thought that rats were drinking red wine on their couch and they were just measuring how they did compared to rats that went to the gym. But that's actually not what happened. So this is something in particular for nutrition, especially something to look at in studies is what I would call like the dosing. So in this study, resveratrol, which is the chemical in red wine that seems to produce all of these effects that seem to be positive most of the time for human health. So what they did is they just gave the rats their same food, except in one group it was just their regular food. In the other group, the resveratrol was put in the food. So like their food, which is basically like if you think of dry food for dogs and cats, it's a similar thing. So they just added this chemical to that food. So it's not like the rats are drinking red wine. And that could be there could be something in red wine where if something else in the red wine is present, resveratrol doesn't have the same effect. Like that could totally happen. And what it also means is that the dose of resveratrol that they got could be so astronomically high compared to what people would normally get. So you'll see that a lot with studies that are looking at either some component of diet or drugs in particular, just something where if you're trying to look at how something affects human behavior, we usually have so many other things mixed in there. But the dosing for studies that are just interested in this one chemical, they will probably give a much higher dose than what we would receive just living our lives and drinking red wine. So that's something that I would certainly, and I wouldn't even know looking at a study on, and many things, whether it's a normal amount, like, oh yes, that is exactly how much a human would receive. I'm just giving kind of a heads up that usually it's higher, because if you see it at those high levels, then you can kind of go back and see, well, how low can you go with the amount? But usually they'll start higher than what people tend to get. And so that's especially something with animal studies, but they'll also do it in people studies as well. Sure. And so even though if a study is done with people, something so like exercise studies especially will tend to be done with people,
Hmm.
something that you could look at even if you don't understand all the statistics and all the graphs and stuff, they're going to be writing clearly about who was in the study. And
Sure.
what you'll see is sometimes, I mean, you could see a study and it's based on 12 people.
Right.
So that's something where that's not a lot. That is not a lot of people. If you think about just how different you and I, and you can take a classroom of people or just everyone at the grocery store, if you think about how different every person is, and then to
Hmm.
think, well, they just took 12 of those people and did a study on them and found an effect. It could be that that's just not enough people, or maybe it's not representative of the human population. Uh,
Sure.
so definitely, I would be more convinced if a study had a sizable, like, I mean, there are studies out there where you could have a couple hundred people in it. It's a bigger study, but I mean, that would be a little more convincing to me than one where, especially when you're looking at behavior, because that's a more time consuming thing to study, you'll see
Mm.
these smaller sample sizes. But again, if you read it, you go, okay, you found that, but it doesn't mean that, we should all stop what we're doing. It's something to consider, but it's a very, very non-representative group.
Sure.
Or on the other hand as well, what you might find is that you're a teenager or you're a senior citizen, and this study was done in adults. Or this study was done in college students and you're in your 30s.
Right.
Maybe that doesn't work the same. Whatever they're looking at is only for a certain age group and wouldn't work the same in an older population or a younger population. And then finally, especially as a woman, something that you'll see a lot in the scientific literature is that they tend to be biased towards studying men and studying
Huh.
even animals. They will study male animals.
I never
Uh,
noticed that. That's interesting.
yeah, and so the rationale behind that is that women and females are messy because of our menstrual cycles and
Sure.
estrus and all. So all female animals, we go through slightly different things, but we all have a cycle because we get
Hmm.
pregnant and things like that. And so the rationale is that that makes us complicated. And so why complicate things? Let's just not study them. It'll be the same. Men are the default, and women will just do the same thing. And I think the trend is changing for that. So, in the federal government, the branch of the government that funds human health studies, which is the National Institutes of Health,
Hmm.
they've begun instituting that if you do not include male and female animals in your study, that you have to have a very, very good reason for it, which
Okay.
is a different approach than what they used to do, which is that they didn't really consider the sex of the animals in the study. But that's something where if you're a woman reading a study and it's all the participants in the study are men, that's something to think critically about.
I'm glad you share that because I never even thought to look for that, or I'm sure now that you say that I'll notice it more,
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's just, it's really something to think about. And there's been a couple situations, and I didn't research this offhand to know specifically, but I think there is a sleep medication that they actually found after it was already being given to the general public that it profoundly affected women differently. And so, like, they were still having, like, they would be awake and get into car accidents. And
oh
they
my
were
goodness.
piecing together that it was because this sleep medicine was metabolizing differently in women. And it
Sure.
was all the trials were done in men.
Oh my goodness, that's crazy. Well, and definitely, yeah, good things to consider. I know when I used to teach biology to high school students, we would often look at the commercial products that were talked about and the research and studies that were done to say that they worked. And a lot of times the studies or the research that was done to prove that a product works, it's not peer reviewed. And I think people, or it's paid for by, let's just say, for example, Adidas, and the study was promoting an Adidas shoe, right? So it's kind of, we think we hear the word study or we hear the word research and we think, that it's infallible and we have to listen to it, but definitely worth checking that out more for lots of reasons.
Oh yeah, I mean I would say that's on my list. If especially if they're testing something, the effect of something, and it's something that can be bought or affects somebody's bottom line, even down to water, because there's a water industry.
Right.
If they're clear, they're going to say that it worked, and I would definitely scrutinize who funded the research, because if a company has a product, they're funding research for it, they're not going to publish that it didn't work.
Right.
So that's a simplistic way of looking at it, but certainly most studies do not have that conflict of interest, if you
Right.
will, but it's definitely good to check out. Or there could be organizations that just have their own bias. I'm thinking about things like climate change and vaccines, where if they already have kind of an agenda going in, they could influence what studies emerge from their funding. So.
Sure. No, absolutely. So what do we do then, Amy? Do we know nothing about anything because we can't really trust these studies a lot of the times?
Oh, I know it can seem like if you're like me, so I definitely am. I analyze studies because I do them, so we have
Right.
to learn from each other. But science, do not lose faith in science. It is a slow march, but it is a very important march to be on, and we've made amazing strides learning both through animal models and studying humans. I think for things like how do we understand health and diet and things like that, what you don't want to do is put everything into one study. But certainly, if there is truly an effect of something on the human body, multiple studies are going to start pointing to that effect. So I'm thinking, even just the benefit of exercise. I mean, it might be coming out in different ways by independent studies, but the effect is still there, that exercise is good for us, exercise is good for our mental health. And so the fancy word we use for this is replication. So if one study finds, say, the effects of coffee on something with the body, if they do it and they publish it, and then another group comes in and studies a similar thing and finds the same effect, that's more convincing that there might be something there. So definitely, as studies start pointing to, in all the different iterations, I'm thinking things like coffee, dark chocolate, red wine, like there's different studies about them, and also like in the opposite direction, processed foods. Like, okay, multiple studies are pointing in the direction that these things are having some sort of effect. And again, the dosing is important and all that, but they're doing something. And I guess what I think of, the strongest argument I could give you is that this is what they were finding for the effects of nicotine on the body. So that was something where it's not one giant study that said cigarettes are bad for you, but it was really the piecing together of the evidence from multiple studies. So if you keep an eye out, you'll start to see what the trend is for scientific consensus through multiple studies.
So we don't have to throw out whatever item they're going to tell us, tomorrow is not good for us, and we don't have to go and stock up and get a bulk order of whatever is good.
No, yeah, I'd wait a couple years and see how the science pans out before doing that.
Got it. Well, thanks so much, Amy, for being on the show for this. I think it's really important because, we have to just be educated consumers, educated individuals, right? Learning and trying to process all the research out there. So I really appreciate you helping us navigate that. Where can we find and connect with you, and maybe find some of the links to your studies or studies that you're interested in to kind of keep the conversation going, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter. So I'm at Amy_M_Ryan. I would say that's the place I keep most up to date, keep it fresh there. I do have a link to my website on there, but certainly I'll post things about science, so interesting studies, but also today we talked a lot about the process behind science. And so that's something where there's a lot of scientists on Twitter that I really enjoy networking with and talking with and learning from them. And to us, these are all relevant points about getting science out to the public and how science is perceived and how to get information through accurately, but in an engaging way and in a meaningful way. So that's something there that you can check out. And certainly you can message me, follow me, and certainly keep you up to date on what I'm doing.
Awesome. Love it. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks again for being on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Fit 15. For show notes and more, visit fitarmadillo.com/podcast. See you next time.